Welcome back to the State of the Union conference. This is the final session of day one, and this is the conversation on global economy. Back on stage is Alexander Stubb, and this conversation we're expecting to hear from
Kristalina Georgieva. But alas, things happen, when you do live programs, there seems to be a connection problem, and what we're working on at the moment is to get the connection at least on audio, and we're hoping to hear Kristalina soon enough. But now I became the person to be interviewed, I guess.
So I'll do that as we're waiting for Kristalina Georgieva to join us, of course. Now, this is the hybrid event, and I think over the past year, since the beginning of the pandemic, we have all got really used to some connection challenges and troubles every now and then, right?
Yeah, you don't get that stressed about them anymore. You work with live TV, I've had my own blunders throughout my career. So these things happen when you're dealing with technology, and you can't always trust it. I think, today has gone really well in other aspects. We haven't really had any problems technically, and these things happen. But we had a big COVID session here a while back, and we had an audio problem. So, these things happen.
It happens, yeah, absolutely. So the conversation, the final one, the final session of the day one, is on global economy. And let me ask you this, just over a year since the beginning of the pandemic, what started initially as a health crisis turned into a massive economic COVID-19 crisis. What's your conclusions, lessons to draw over this year?
Yeah, well, I think every leader around the world is going to be basically judged on three criteria. The first criteria is quite morbid. It's the number of fatalities, both in the beginning of the pandemic and later on as well. So people are doing a lot of comparing and contrasting, either per capita or in general. The second criteria is going to be on the vaccine rollout. There seems to be this sort of competition of who can get there first to 70%. And of course, today was really interesting to listen to President Ursula von der Leyen. She basically came out and said she's confident that the target of the European Union of 70% of adults will be vaccinated by the end of July. And on top of that, she said, listen, we are the pharmacy of the world. 200 million doses distributed in Europe and 200 million doses exported around the world. And that's a very strong claim, and it's a strong message as well. So that's the second criteria. And the third criteria is the one that you're asking about, is the economy. And I think a lot of people around the world are going to, look, okay, how do we get out of this? It's been an exceptional year. You could say that everyone basically turned Keynesian and went and started stimulating the economies. And I think the European Union, because this is a State of the Union, was actually quite quick in the way in which it reacted.
Well, I'm sure that you heard lots of criticism when it comes to the situation in the European Union with vaccine rollout, and there were some saying that it was rather slow, comparing it to some other countries. What's your take on that? Because of course this is so crucial for everything, for all of us to get back to normal as much as possible, for the economy to recover as much as possible and as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I think the logic of the public communication and the discourse that we have on it is quite human and natural in a sense. So in the beginning, everyone packs together, say, okay, we'll get out of this together. Well, then when we get a bit bored with what's going on, we start looking at the bad side. And of course, I think the vaccine debate started only in January. I think good news number one, we have vaccines. Good news number two, we have plenty of them. And hopefully good news number three is we'll get the rollout. So my take on it is that there is a lag, and I'm sorry, I'm only talking about the Western world here. There's a lag of roughly 4 to 6 weeks between the European Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. But what all leaders do is they focus on what they're best at. So that's why you'll probably see, Boris Johnson banging his chest and say, the UK is doing well. Well, the EU is going to catch up with the UK in the summer. But that's not going to solve the crisis because, no one is safe until everyone is safe, and we need to get the vaccines out there into the world.
Let's just check quickly if we have Kristalina Georgieva joining us. We are experiencing some trouble, but she's joining us on audio.
Kristalina, hello, are you there?
Hi, I'm right here, Alex. I'm very sorry that video is fading us, but hopefully we can still have a good conversation just on voice.
There's always a good conversation when you are involved. And of course, paradoxically, remember, we were thinking about recording this event. But hey, that's a bygone now. Let's, with remaining 20 minutes that we have, let's go through, if you allow me, Kristalina, a few things to our audience. You will know, of course, Kristalina is one of our superstars. She's now a managing director of the IMF, former commissioner, and many other things. And let's try to focus on three things. And let's begin with an overview of the global economic outlook and focus on that. My first question to you, Kristalina, is you were involved in the financial crisis and the euro crisis, and now you've been involved in the COVID crisis. How different is the COVID crisis from the financial crisis, looking at it from the IMF's perspective?
It is different in three ways. One, this is a truly global crisis. During the global financial crisis, it was advanced economies primarily, with emerging markets, many of them coming through quite soundly. Secondly, it is a very unusual crisis in which both demand and supply are being hit. We basically said to producers, don't produce, and to consumers, don't consume. And thirdly, it is very different in terms of the impact we now see of very significantly different fiscal space for action and different situation in vaccinations across the world. To put it very simply, what we face is a risk of a great divergence. One part of the world, primarily advanced economies, some emerging markets, likely to recover much faster, whereas the rest of the emerging markets and low-income countries falling further behind. And that calls for concentration on how we can accelerate the exit from the crisis everywhere. And we know there are two things we all must focus on and do. One, recognize that vaccine policy in 21, in 22 is number one economic policy. Vaccinations everywhere is the one and only pathway to end the crisis around the world. And two, help countries with less capacity of their own. And there is where places like the IMF have stepped up. We have provided support to 86 countries. Never we have done so much so fast. And with the help of our membership, we are coming up with $650 billion new allocation of special drawing rights, the reserve assets of the IMF, to boost reserves everywhere.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see the IMF is taking on a different type of role this time around. And I think you're absolutely right that in many ways it's a global crisis. So in that sense, it's symmetrical. But the way in which it's hit us is asymmetrical, and the way in which we get out of it is going to be asymmetrical as well. Could you go through perhaps a couple of the ideas on the forecasts? I mean, how do you see the global forecast? When was the last time you came out with numbers, and how do you see the economy developing in the coming months?
We came in April with somewhat better picture for the world economy. It is on sound footing. We have two engines working strongly, the US and the Chinese economy. And we expect that by the summer, the European Union will also catch up with vaccinations, and on the back of those vaccinations, accelerate the recovery. What we put as a number for this year, 6% growth. For next year, 4.4% economic growth. This is on face value very strong, but let's remember that the world economy shrunk by 3.3% in 2020, and catching up for majority of countries is going to be a very long haul. We expect that this year 150 economies will finish below their pre-crisis level, below 2019 level, And what is even more troubling, we expect that 110 economies will be still below their pre-crisis level next year, by the end of next year. So when we look at the picture, we recognize that this uneven recovery is a serious problem to be mindful of. And also in our projections for this and next year, we were clear that there is a great deal of uncertainty, and the uncertainty is mostly in the race between the virus and the vaccine. We have seen very, very troubling developments in India. We don't yet know how the various mutations are going to work. And in that context, it is paramount to have international cooperation on the health front as well as on the economic front. We are in this together. We can come out of it only together.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, a second theme I wanted to touch upon is a little bit sort of the idea of green recovery from COVID and climate change and sustainability. I've just been immersed in Bill Gates' latest book, and he talks about, the world emitting or adding roughly 51 tons of carbon per year. And I know that, you've been very adamant in your fight against climate change and green issues. So, how can we my first question is, how can we make use of the crisis to establish more resilient and sustainable economies?
If we learned something from this crisis, is that we have to think of resilience in a different manner, much broader than what we did after the 2009 crisis, when our focus was the resilience of the banking system. What was done worked. We thankfully do not face now a financial crisis, but it is simply not enough for a world that is much more shock prone. And without any doubt, the climate crisis is as dramatic, if not as sudden, as the COVID crisis, and maybe even more so. When we look at resilience in the context of what we learned from the COVID crisis, we need to have resilient people that are educated, healthy, with social protection that allows them to absorb shocks, to be able to continue to function. We need a resilient planet, something that we have been unfortunately and regrettably ignoring for far too long. And of course, we need resilient economies in which there is clear capacity to use our tax system to raise revenues and then improve the quality of our spending so we make best use of money. When we started assessing how this crisis is affecting the attitudes toward climate, initially, many of us, me included, we were very worried that the climate crisis would fall off the attention of the world because of COVID. But actually, the exact opposite seems to have happened. People are more aware that we are dependent on Mother Nature and we are dependent on each other. And what we are seeing is gradually much more attention to how a response to COVID can be green. And that is translating into shift upwards of spending public and also private for climate resilience. In the very first round, by October in 2020, very little, some 5% of the funding that went to fight the COVID-induced economic crisis went for low-carbon, climate-resilient investments. This percentage is moving upwards, and I want to say bravo to the EU the 37% commitment in the Next Generation EU is exactly the example everybody must follow. And obviously, we are advocating at the IMF for a three-pronged approach. One, put a price on carbon and gradually increase this price to have a good, strong incentive for decarbonization. Two, public investment on a massive scale to create the infrastructure for the new climate economy. Three, just transition. Make sure that those parts of the economy and those parts of society, people negatively affected by this transition, are being helped so we can all move together into a sustainable future.
Yeah, I think that's a very clear and good three-point agenda to have, and I really like the way in which you framed it, that actually COVID has made us more aware of the climate issues. And I think you're absolutely right. The fight against climate change is not something that we're going to regulate ourselves out of. It's going to have to come through incentives and technological innovation, of course. By the way, I think the interesting fact is that if we emit 51 tons of carbon, billion tons of carbon per year, in the COVID year we will have done roughly 4 billion tons less. But the energy consumption is not going to be reduced, and that's why I think your agenda, Kristalina, at the IMF is very good. Now, let me move to the third and final area that I wanted to discuss today, and that's sort of the responses to the pandemic, because in the words of Ivan Krastsev, one of your countrymen, I think he said there's been this sort of dictatorship of comparisons, but you could look at it from a positive side as well. You can compare and contrast. So what do you think are the best practices to get back on track from the pandemic? Which are the countries that have done well?
What we have seen is that countries that have done well have introduced measures to control the pandemic early, and they have applied science-based approach by contact tracing, testing in a regular manner, and keeping the people safe, but then also the economy functioning. And it is not really a matter of rich or poor countries. It is a matter of being prudent. A country like Vietnam has done really well. A country like South Korea has done really well. And we see now the next stage of vaccinations done in a systematic and again, science-based manner. The second is how countries have used fiscal space to concentrate on the most vulnerable people and most vulnerable parts of the economy. And of course, here it is much more income dependent. Advanced economies have provided 28% nearly of GDP to support through monetary and fiscal policy their businesses and their people. Emerging markets around 7%, low-income countries less than 2%, 1.9% of their tiny GDP. So we have to recognize that some actions policymakers take wisely, but others they cannot easily take without some degree of international cooperation. And perhaps the important thing for us to face is that this is not over. We are still to come through this crisis. How governments, policymakers, and businesses are going to act in the recovery to reduce scarring is going to matter tremendously. And here I want to make 2 points. One is inevitably policy support will have to be withdrawn. That has to be done very carefully because last year bankruptcies were less than the average in the previous years. Why? Because of the massive policy support. Yes, it helped us to steer through the crisis. Alex, it would have been 3 times deeper recession without this support. But it cannot be sustained forever. And once we start withdrawing these policy measures, then inevitably firms that are on weaker footing in sectors that are shrinking as we exit the crisis, they're going to be in a tougher spot, and bankruptcies are going to go up. So good insolvency frameworks built to help in this transition are going to be hugely, hugely important. And then two, we need to prepare for the interest rates possibly going up. Especially important to watch U.S. interest rates because of the significance movement there has for the rest of the world. And when we say low for longer, we don't mean low forever. Once this inevitable process of strong growth reflecting into change in the accommodation of monetary policy, then we face a very serious risk of this great divergence I spoke about. Those countries that are not yet growing, that are falling behind in an environment of potentially interest rates going up, if they are especially under high debt level, they may find themselves in a very tough spot. So thinking about the scarring of the crisis, how we exit the necessary accommodative policies, how we do it prudently, this is going to be the next important stage. And I must say, I'm not sure that the easiest part is ahead. It may very well prove that moving into the next stage of the recovery would demand a lot from policy makers. And one final point, a crisis is an opportunity. We know that we have had problems before. Alex, we had anemic growth, low productivity, a looming climate crisis, and protests in many countries because of inequality going up. How we deal with these problems now that we have a chance to reform the tax policy, make it fit for the 21st century, how we address inequalities, how we deal with the climate crisis, this is going to be our legacy, and it is up to us to make it so that we are moving into a fairer and greener future.
I think that's a wonderful way to put it, and I would love to end it at this. But there's one thing, Kristalina, I'm going to have to ask you. This has been a newsworthy, interesting day in many ways. You will know, because I know you and I are both avid activists on Twitter, so you follow things, you follow news much like I do. The big issue yesterday emerged when President Joe Biden said that they would lift intellectual property rights on vaccines, basically patents. And today, of course, we started the State of the Union with President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, saying the sort of essentially same thing, or saying she's open to discussing it. Now, after that, we've seen Chancellor Angela Merkel being a little bit more skeptical about it. So this is a sort of wannabe journalist in me. What is the position or what is the view of managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva? Yeah. Will this help and alleviate the production of vaccines? So what are your initial thoughts on this, basically?
At the IMF, we have been very clear that the economic argument for removing obstacles to accelerate production and to speed up vaccination is very strong. We will be $9 trillion richer between now and 2025 if we accelerate vaccinations. Making it possible to scale up production is one contributor to then making this crisis sooner rather than later one we exit durably from. But let me make 2 points. This would only work if we have 2 conditions in place. One, a very transparent process of allocating production capacity and then distribution of vaccines that are being produced. Today, we simply don't quite know how much is being produced, where, who has contracted it, what is the delivery schedule, what does it mean for a fair distribution of vaccines. And that transparency is paramount. I know that many in the G20 are talking about more transparent coordination of production. So if there would be moving some production capacity faster in developing countries, if there is transparency, that would certainly help. 2, we need to remember there are reasons why people are concerned about it. And the number 1 reason is a health reason, and it is counterfeit. Getting vaccines produced in a non-viable manner, to put it very politely, or just simply making money out of messing up what the production actually is. So there is value in this extraordinary crisis to take this extraordinary step for temporarily. Some say maybe 18 months is the period we needed, maybe 2 years, to ease the expansion of production. But it is not a silver bullet. It does require these other 2 aspects, transparency and measures to prevent counterfeiting vaccines, which, by the way, has already happened in a couple of places. And that is why I think the attention to that, the putting in place a sound system to do it is so very, very critical.
I think this is a really good way to end the discussion. I think your argumentation in this case for easing the intellectual property rights was very measured and well qualified. It's always a privilege to talk to you, Kristalina. This time around we didn't see you on the screen, but perhaps next year we can see each other here at the State of the Union live.
So that is my promise, Alex. I will be there 3-dimensional next time.
Lovely. And I will give you a hug next time around without a mask as well. With these words, we start wrapping it up for today. I would like to thank personally, of course, Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the IMF, for joining us. And then I will hand it over to Sasha, who's been our wonderful master of ceremony for the whole day.
Thank you so much to Kristalina Georgieva for this closing session, and thanks to all of our speakers today. That is indeed a wrap, but only a wrap for day 1. Stay tuned. Tomorrow we are back for the second day of the 10th anniversary of the State of the Union.